break. We are here ready to continue, and next we have a fireside chat with Roy Ng. Roy Ng is the co-founder and CEO of Bond. I want to thank our friends at Lohika for partnering with us to make this fireside chat happen. Welcome, Roy. How you doing?
Hey, how are you? Hey, David.
Good. I'm having a wonderful day. I hope you are as well. I want to dive right into the questions because we already have some folks asking them, but also have some pre-prepared ones to buy folks some time. This first one is, I'd love to hear about your background, given that you've had senior roles at developer-centric companies like Twilio, et cetera. Feel free to let folks know a little bit about yourself.
Awesome. Well, I started my career in finance. So I spent about the first decade on the investment banking side, working at a firm called Goldman Sachs. There, I worked at a ton of technology companies, and I really fell in love with one, a company called SuccessFactors. I ended up taking the company public as a banker and ended up joining them as an operator. And so from there, I've had the good fortune of working with great companies, great founder CEOs, great teams. We ended up selling SuccessFactors to SAP. I was there for a little bit, running the cloud business unit. After that, I partnered with Jeff Lawson at Twilio as Twilio COO to help scale out the business, especially on the commercial side. I also went to another developer platform company called Mapbox to help them really scale out, again, their commercial functions. And since last year, I've been starting my own company as a fintech infrastructure platform company called Bond. We basically enable non-banks to be able to offer financial products. We take all of the infrastructure and the relationship with banks and the various technology vendors and put it under one roof so that our tech companies can offer out things like credit card, debit cards very easily to their end users.
I love that. You have a variety of experiences, being at a developer-centric organization where developers are your target audience, if you will. That's something that not everybody has the opportunity to experience. I think that's awesome. And in addition, IPOing, being on the finance side as well as on the operating side, you have a lot of perspective and experience. I'm going to invite everybody who's listening, anybody that has a question, who wants to know about Roy's experience. It could be at Twilio, it could be at SuccessFactors, it could be going IPO. There's plenty of questions to ask. Feel free to put them on the side of your screen in the Q&A tab. Ask questions that you have, upvote questions from others. And until then, I will ask more from my own set, but feel free to ask your own questions as well. So this next question, hearing about your backgrounds and your perspectives, I imagine that you've seen different models for how engineering managers run their teams. I'm curious to hear, what different models have you seen? Which ones work, which ones don't? Just kind of curious to get like the lay of the land.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think obviously different organizations have kind of different DNAs, and as a result, various functions kind of are structured differently. I think in more traditional enterprise software companies, there are, there's the kind of commercial team, the customer-facing team. They work with customers, get their requirements, talk to product about it, and product then lays out a roadmap, a development roadmap, and work with the engineers to basically go execute on those products. And I would say, a lot of software companies are built that way, and I think built very successfully. With developer platform companies, though, what I find is developers are closer to the mix in the beginning. The reason, obviously, is because the end customers we're looking to serve are developers in and of themselves. And so having developers in the front end, so be it in sales conversations or even as part of the product ideation process, is actually very, very useful. And in fact, they add a lot of great insights as to how we should be structuring the product, in many cases also structuring the deals such that it's the right outcome for the developers. And so I would say those are the two kind of different rough models that I've seen.
And it's interesting, knowing that you have this background, the finance side, the business side, but again, you've dealt with developers as direct customers and you understand, that side as well. We obviously have a lot of engineers and engineering managers who are listening right now. Do you have any thoughts on how engineers and engineering managers can better understand the company's overall business?
Yeah. I would say, get in front of the customers, get closer to the customers. I think oftentimes, engineers work very closely with product to execute on the roadmap. I think especially, what I found is, since COVID and everything's going remote, instead of sales teams flying all over the world, kind of engaging with customers, most of our conversations are remote through Zoom and other video conferencing systems. And so, this is a great opportunity for developers or engineering managers to kind of jump on customer calls. Like raise your hand, jump on a customer call is much easier than before, and get right in the thick of things. And then, the more context you have in terms of what the customer is looking for, the more productive and the more satisfying the build is going to be.
It makes sense. I reflect for myself, just when I've been managing engineering teams and the individual managers or engineers themselves aren't, for whatever reason, aren't reaching the level that one would hope for them to reach, et cetera. I've always found that connecting them and exposing them to the customers in some way, whether that be in a user study or whatever means possible, that enables them to be more effective in the moment. Yeah.
Totally. And then I think the second is around just asking why. I think it always asks why. I think especially on the engineering side, I think, from the business perspective, from a customer perspective, there may be some ideas that get translated into product and the product roadmap. But, if you don't understand the context as to why you're building a certain things or why it's being built a certain way, I always kind of encourage teams to really ask why. Is in fact one of our principles, business principles, because until you understand the why, will you be able to kind of build the right thing for the customer?
100%. It's so interesting how on the engineering side of things, sometimes we get so siloed and so in the weeds on something so specific that we kind of lose the forest through the trees. So I can appreciate the value of that principle. So I'm going to dive into questions from folks. So this first question from M, what is the development process, for example, Scrum or otherwise, what should that look like for a customer-focused team?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think, having as small a team structure as possible really drive toward customer orientation. The reason is, I think when you have smaller teams, it's less of a kind of a waterfall, meaning like, hey, look, there's a canonical kind of like right way of building something from someone, be it product or the go-to-market teams, and you just execute. But instead, I think when you have a small team, the developers within that small team now can basically participate in a lot of the decision makings. They are directly in front of the customer. They understand what is the use case, what is the problem we're looking to solve. And not only do the teams need to be small, but I think autonomous teams are also very important in driving kind of a customer focus orientation, because autonomy enables you to kind of coordinate with other teams, but you minimize the dependencies. Oftentimes I see kind of, well, we're waiting on that team to do something, and so as a result, we're kind of like standing still. I think serving customers, customer focus to me means speed to delivery, speed to kind of going from idea to basically getting to what we believe the customer really wants. And you may not get it right the first time. Most companies do not get it right the first time. And most companies, even after you get it right the first time, is all about continual iteration and making the product even better. And so I would say, small autonomous teams, I think, there was a saying back at Twilio, communicate via APIs across teams instead of having more meetings to kind of go discuss stuff. And so to the extent that you could build interfaces across different teams, that doesn't kind of necessitate kind of, the meetings, I think that will kind of drive toward a faster response to kind of customers' needs. I think from maybe there's not a development process per se, but just how people make decisions. Obviously, every day, be it engineers or engineering managers make decisions. And, one of the things that, we adopt here at Bond and also at other companies I've seen that is effective is this whole kind of, I don't know if you've heard of this kind of type 1, type 2 decision making, right? Where the type 1 decision are things that is not easily reversible, versus type 2 decisions are things that, hey, look, you can easily reverse and you just iterate from there. And I think a lot of companies treat a lot of decisions like type 1 decisions. Wow, once you make it, it's kind of set in stone. But in reality, if you think about it further, they're actually easily, reversible, and you can kind of learn from it. And so, back to the kind of time to kind of addressing customers' needs, like the more we can empower small teams to make decisions, in particular, there's plenty of these type 2 decisions all over the company. And so if you step up, make a decision, that allows you to kind of, move your team's kind of mandate forward very quickly without kind of boggling down with other teams and the rest of the organization.
I'm also reminded how autonomy is like one of the number one indicators of an individual's success on the job. So I very much appreciate, how important autonomy is.
Yeah.
It makes sense, this idea. I'm actually not sure if I'm familiar with that idea of type 1 and type 2, decisions, but it's a very simple way of looking at things. And 100%, I certainly, I'm sure many of us who are listening have been in situations where there was a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of, senior people involved to make a decision that, someone might have treated like a type 1 decision, but it was really a type 2 decision. And, you just want people to be able to move quickly. So
and it's actually pretty hard, right? I think, as I reflect my own career, when you start your career, you feel like every decision is a type 1 decision. Everything that you do, every mistake you make potentially is a type 1 decision that is not reversible. I think as you continue to grow in your career in particular, you realize through, judgment that, more and more of those decisions are in fact kind of type 2 decisions, not type 1 decisions. And so I think that's a big kind of a learning, I think, for folks. Like, it doesn't matter if you're an engineer or anywhere in the org, but being able to recognize that and have that kind of judgment call, I think is really important.
100%. This next question from Masanu: usually the sales or customer success teams are very cautious about letting engineers talk to the customers from their portfolio. How do you convince them, that it's not too risky to do that?
What we generally do with any sort of customer engagement is we have a pre-game, like we have a pre-conversation, like internally. So be it with customer success, our engineers, before we go into that customer meeting, hey, look, what are some of the objectives we're trying to get across during this meeting? Make sure that, there's like roles and responsibilities in the meeting. The customer success person is in charge of talking through these topics. Engineers are there to talk through these topics, and, also think through, potential questions that may come back from the customer and who would handle those. I think once you're able to kind of pregame like that meeting, I think your customer success team will be much more comfortable, or your sales team much more comfortable around, like various folks participating. I am always of the view that I want more people participate than less. Even if it's not a speaking role per se, I think you can learn a lot from direct customer interactions.
100%. This next question, actually from the same person, but got a lot of upvotes, so I'm going for it. After a certain stage, for example, the director level, the C level sees you still as an engineer, but the engineers see you as an executive. How do you handle that situation where you're basically not belonging anymore to either group, and how can you still be effective?
Interesting. Yeah, so I think this is a very interesting question, because I think, the reality is, the teams that you directly manage will see you grow as a leader. You've taken on more and more responsibilities. Your team's potentially like larger now, and your scope is broader. But I think your peers or kind of like the executive level may be still stuck on when you first joined the company, and you started as like an IC or an engineering manager. Now that you're a director or above, like they don't see that. I think part of it is also raising questions that is not typically kind of an engineering question, right? If you start asking questions beyond kind of like the typical scope of an engineer, you're asking business-oriented questions. You're looking at the big picture, and back to my original kind of fly around, asking why about certain decisions. Maybe jumping into, why are we pricing the product a certain way? Why are deployments done this way versus another way? Then it kind of gets you out of kind of like that just pure engineering mindset. I think, David, you talked about kind of, you're in the weeds all the time, but like, how do you kind of get back to the forest? And so I think as C-level executives, like, we dive into critical things, but we cannot dive into every single thing at that like level of detail. And so if you're able to elevate the dialogue that you have with executives, I think that's one way of kind of getting you kind of the visibility you need as an executive.
What I extract from what you just said is that kind of there's this level of, for lack of better words, empathy, which is something we've talked about earlier today, but where you're actually connecting and trying to absorb from the other person, right? And if that person is an executive, it's like, what are you trying to do? Why? And connecting there. And if it's an engineer, it's what are you trying to do? Why? And then if you're in that receptive space where you're trying to solve the problems of the folks around you, regardless of what level they're in, that they'll perceive you as useful, helpful, valuable, and doing an effective job.
Totally. And remember, I think the question was, engineers see you as an executive, but maybe the C-level still see you as an engineer. Think about it if you were that C-level executive, what is that person, to your point about empathy, what is that person carrying right now? Let's say it's end of quarter. They're really they want to know, are we hitting our numbers for this quarter, right? So maybe the dialogue that you're having with the C-level executive team is around kind of what they may be thinking about. So beyond kind of your day-to-day duties, but kind of, empathize what that level of executives may be concerned about or focused on.
Sure. This next question from Alex, I can sense from it a hint of, I don't know if I'd say pushback, but just questioning something, which is, the question is, why do engineers really need to be customer focused? Shouldn't they focus on building what the product owner tells them to, since the product owner is the customer expert and determines the product backlog? Why would it be necessary for them?
I think to each their own, right? I'm not saying that's only one way of doing things. I would say, at least a lot of the engineers that I've worked with, where they derive a lot of satisfaction and understand more of the context about what they're building and why they're building it and how it's going to get used. And I think in the end, it also enables engineers to, I think you derive at least the people I speak with, derive a little bit more satisfaction out of the product that they're building. Obviously, being technical experts in terms of executing and, piggybacking and leveraging kind of your product owner to kind of synthesize what the customer needs. That will still happen. I'm not saying there's no more product managers, there's no more salespeople, and engineers go do everything. What I'm advocating for is, more involvement with the customer. And, why do engineers need to be customer focused? My answer generally is every single person in the company needs to be customer focused. It's not just really an engineering thing, because in the end, your customers is who you're serving, is why you exist as a company. And so if you don't understand your customer, why do you even exist, right? So I think understand the big picture, understanding the customer to me, is pretty critical.
100%. And I reflect on myself, that when you're in the weeds, if you will, and you're an engineer and you're getting things done, that, sometimes you're fortunate enough to have a product manager or product owner that gives very deep details for every piece of what you're doing, but sometimes you don't. There's occasionally a product manager or two or three or four who doesn't provide that extreme level of detail for every edge case, or you encounter something that maybe the product manager didn't anticipate as you're building it. And that's one of those situations where I can imagine that if you have perspective there, that you might be able to anticipate, a reasonable decision, and, for example, be unblocked by taking a stab at it if you can't reach the product person. So
totally. And I think it also gives product a little bit more leverage when the engineers kind of can think through stuff. So instead of kind of going really deep into a spec, they could probably have a little bit, the product managers can have a broader surface area as a result to tackle kind of other customer problems, where the engineers can also dig in and fill in the gap, so to speak, in specs that are maybe not as detailed, right? So I think it really depends on the personality, but I mean, I think overall my philosophy has always been, it doesn't matter where you are, be it you're an engineer or a customer success person or a finance person. Frankly, you need to be customer focused.
100%. This next question from Pavan: as a company CEO, how do you set up a successful company, management between business and finance and technical leadership? You see so many different ways of navigating that, of handling that. And, I think some folks who've never kind of been exposed to stuff at that level are kind of curious, how do you navigate that whole thing?
I think, back to transparency, right? I think, at the team leadership level, we have a lot of transparency with the leaders leading the kind of various parts of the organization. And we meet regularly, sometimes once a week, sometimes twice a week, to kind of get all the different functions aligned. And when I work with my executives, I always say, when you come into this executive meeting, take off your functional hat. I don't care if you are the VP of engineering or the VP of partnerships or you're the head of finance. Like, take off that hat. You're sitting in this executive meeting as an executive, looking at this company holistically. So I always encourage folks like our head of compliance to weigh in on product, our finance people weighing in on sales, our sales people weigh in on engineering. I want people to be owners of the company holistically, not just owning a particular function within the organization. And obviously we brought those leaders in for their expertise in those specific functions. But when we have a dialogue, as an executive team, I really want everybody to kind of take off that functional hat, really kind of think more broadly, because I've seen places where, as companies continue to grow, silos kind of continue to grow, especially across functions. And, if you can't kind of get a line on one page at the executive level, it's very hard for the rest of the organization to follow.
I'm reminded how something in kind of like human-computer interaction land, there's concepts called heuristic analysis, where you look at a user interface and enumerate all of the ways in which it has problems. And the research shows that experts see only one set of these problems in a given UI, whereas novices, like people that are just totally new to the whole thing, see a completely different set of problems. You actually need both to be able to see the full picture. And I'm reminded of that kind of as you're talking about, on the business side, right? That even as an expert in something, there's something that experts don't see in their own domain because they've just kind of adjusted to it so much. And that's where sometimes having a novice or somebody in a completely different domain ask a question can actually surface something that the expert didn't see.
Yep, 100%.
Great. So this next question from Ling, when you say small autonomous teams, we were talking about autonomy and autonomous teams before. They're just curious, how small are the engineering teams at Bond?
Right now, our teams depends, about 3 to 4, some of them 5, but we try to keep it as small as possible, where there are product folks and engineers in kind of, we have a pod structure within Bond, so various different pods. They handle different parts of the product, and we're continuing to try to drive toward less dependencies. It's pretty hard. It's actually, in order to design pods that are autonomous, you actually have to be very thoughtful about number one, how do you carve out or delineate the different pods? Number two is, what are the interfaces that you could have across pods so that it minimizes kind of dependencies and slowness. But yeah, that's kind of like small autonomous teams that can make decisions.
Makes sense.
And Jeff Bezos had this thing called a 2 pizza team. So if the team is cannot be fed by 2 pizzas, it's too big.
I love that. We've heard different methodologies to be able to assess kind of team size and scale and structure. And, some folks have talked about, whether it's 7 plus or minus 2 for, for when you're managing a team and the number of folks you have on the team. Some folks talk about making sure that you have a bell curve, or in terms of senior versus not senior people on one side or the other. So it's interesting to hear everyone's perspective on that subject. This next question from Jeff Lee is, customer service is speed from idea to delivery. So regarding that, what are some key decisions you've made in the past to enhance that speed? And what were the trade-offs in prioritizing it?
Sorry, repeat that beginning part again.
Yeah, sure. So customer service is speed from idea to delivery. When you were kind of talking about when you're being effective, right? That it's really about that speed to get there. So what are some key decisions you've made in the past to enhance that speed? I imagine this comes from a place where a lot of folks are struggling with, maybe not going nearly as fast as they want to. Sorry, I have a dog in the background running around. What were the trade-offs in prioritizing it?
Yeah, I would say, customer service is speed from idea to delivery. I think that's correct. I think, sometimes you trade off delivering kind of the most beautiful product or the most kind of tested product to the end customer. I think what I generally see is, great engineers, great product folks, obviously have a pride of ownership. And so what is the point in which you deliver that new thing to your customer? And there's always a trade-off between, well, let me wait another 2 sprints before we kind of deliver it so we could kind of work out the rest of the bugs, versus, well, let's maybe know that there will be some bugs here, but I want to kind of get the customers, to touch it, play with it, give us some feedback and continue. And so that's always a fine line. Giving things that are, quote unquote half-baked or like less mature has its advantages, but also, it may cause a perceived kind of deficiency in the customer's eyes if you kind of do it too early. So I think to me, that's kind of the trade-off. It depends on the thing you're delivering. And, for example, I think this relates to kind of that type 1, type 2 decision, right? If these are things that we know can iterate and we believe that, like, from a customer's perspective, you have a lot of trust with that customer already, give something a little bit earlier, because they're already using something that they really love from your company and from your team. You're building something new right now. And if you have that trust level you with that customer, you could probably give them something a little bit less mature and less tested, and you'll get that benefit of doubt. But if you are talking to a new customer, excuse me, a new customer that potentially you're trying to win, and it's the first time they're like trying to like use your product, maybe you should do that 2 more sprints of QA before you actually go give it to the customer. So situation by situation, but in general, I agree. Like, speed to delivery is pretty key to customer satisfaction.
I'm definitely reminded that clearly none of these things are one size fits all, but you kind of have to do your research, and your mileage may vary. This next question from Benjamin, there are a lot of folks who are working not only with their internal teams, but also with external teams. In some cases, they use external vendors, So the question is, what's it been like to integrate external teams into your projects? And if you have any reflections on how to do that or who to do it with, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, I know our friends Lohika is sponsoring kind of this session, and we've been working with Lohika. I've worked with Lohika back in the days of Twilio. And when I started Bond, I also engaged with Lohika. But my philosophy has always been, treat the external teams as part of your own team as much as possible. And to the extent possible, don't spread them around in such a way that there's one external team member here on this project, another here, but give the team, tangible, ownable projects so that external team can also own and actually drive outcomes. Because if the external team kind of gets diluted into the kind of rest of the internal teams, I think sometimes it's kind of looked upon as, well, they're just kind of like help, basically. They're just helping the internal team. But I think if you have great folks like the folks at Lohika that we work with, they're more than capable of owning discrete projects and driving with it and interfacing with, the other internal teams to kind of drive toward the total solution.
Talking with more and more CTOs, it's definitely clear to me that, having this kind of like fully arm's length, external, throw things over a fence kind of thing is a very old way or old style of doing things. Even folks that are, thousands of miles away, and as you described, integrating into the team and making them part of the team, and creating whatever boundaries that you need to for, whatever compliance you need for your industry, assuming that you do that the more connection, as you described, the better.
Yep.
Great. This next question from Peng, I think it relates to one of the previous things that you were talking about in terms of like kind of having that connection or that empathy of why and the folks above what they need. Peng's wondering, how do we know the pain points of our managers and maybe one level above them?
Ask. I think that's the first step, is to ask. I'm sure you have one-on-ones with your manager. Your manager typically asks how you're doing, right? But sometimes, even for me, when someone asks me how I'm doing, it's like, wow, that's a refreshing kind of, let me tell you how I'm doing, right? I didn't get any sleep because my 14-month-old woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I love to have someone to talk to, right? And so, part of it is ask. I think one-on-ones and conversations are two-way streets. And so just like, it is the manager's responsibility to kind of, make sure that you're doing okay as part of their team. But it's not off bounds to actually ask your manager how they're doing, and ask them what's happening at the company at the highest level, right? Strategically or otherwise, especially like this time of year, we're in December, right? Most companies are going through planning cycles. I'm sure people are looking at headcount for next year and looking at kind of product roadmap for next year, customer goals for next year. This is the perfect time to kind of ask your manager or people 1 or 2 or 3 levels above you, like, how are we thinking about certain things? And so, in those conversations, pain points will surface.
100%. Thank you so much, Roy, for taking the time to share your wisdom, your thoughts as well. And thank you to Lapika, our sponsor, for giving us the opportunity to chat with you. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.